Autumn, cool breezes, ghouls and pumpkins, and of course, rewatching Over the Garden Wall, a heartwarming October tale, and the subject of today's sculpture. I've always loved the eerie pumpkin people, and one scene that stuck into my mind was the moment when our protagonist stumbles in on a pumpkin carving another pumpkin. We're making 3 pumpkins in total today, and each follows a similar path, starting with a ball of aluminum foil wrapped in clay and sectioned off into slices of squash. Then I'll deepen and blend the grooves with some sculpting loops made from takeout chopsticks and guitar wire, softening the rougher edges with isopropyl alcohol. I kept a little pumpkin by my desk for visual reference, just to make sure I didn't stray too far off course. I'll texture the pumpkin with a ball stylus to add the finer lines. Then we'll pop the pumpkin off of its stick, and drill some holes for the arms and neck. Except, oops. I wanted to improve my pumpkin technique anyway, so I'll make a pumpkin on top of the original pumpkin, like a vegetarian turducken, cutting in my own arm and neck holes so that I didn't have to bother with the drill breaking anything else. To make room for the future head, I'll excavate some of the baked clay from the neck hole, then add in some arm wires and fill the ugly gaps with fresh clay. But before I can make the arms, I need to make another pumpkin. I made the orb in the same method as the last one, but instead of leaving it blank, I'll carve a little face into the surface. An empty, thoughtless, vacant face, staring at you. Then I'll add a wee stem to the top, texturing it to look stemmy, and then blending in a few little worms of clay to add some lumps and bumps, before using a couple different tools to make it look separate from the pumpkin flesh. But when I tried to take the mounting stick out, I pulled off a fair bit of rind too. And the last time I checked, pumpkins have bottoms. This is pretty easy to fix by adding some additional clay to the base and blending it in, making sure to match the texture of the rest of the clay. Then while that bakes, we can make the legs. These start off as a smooth V-shaped tube of clay, rolled at the ankles for future ropes to wind around. The limbs of the pumpkin people are made of hay, like scarecrows, so to get that texture I'll start by scratching in a multitude of tiny cuts into the clay, trying to keep the scratches mildly chaotic so that it doesn't look too neat and clean. Then we can stick them on a makeshift seat, and squish our body on top. The pumpkin people, as it turns out, are actually the skeletons of the dead who were buried on the farm. To show that it's not just hay in there, I'll stick a few little bones here and there, jutting out from the straw. Then I'll tie the hay ankles tight with some wound ropes of clay, and then I'll break out some wood shavings that I'd saved a couple months ago, and stick some shrapnel haphazardly into the limbs, loose shards of escaping straw. Then I can get the positioning of the arms correct, and then bulk them out with some clay. These followed pretty much the exact same process as the legs, but I'll make the left arm shaped to hold a tiny little tool that I'll add later on. Besides that, we'll add in the wrists, poke the bones, and stick some extra texture in place. But with that, we'll smooth out the neck, and get started in on the head. The head was probably my favorite out of the 3. You can definitely see an improvement between my first pumpkin and the last one. It's fairly similar to the previous one though, besides a different face, a shocked expression like you've just walked in on his private secret. Then we'll whip up a nice big stem, and backfill the mounting hole. But that's our pumpkin person complete. Now they need something to sit on. Enter this random scrap of corkwood, which is the exact perfect size that I need, once I've cut it down to size. Then we'll cover our box with some clay slabs and squish them tight into a hay bale shape. Now the texture on this starts off similar to how I did the arms and legs earlier, complete with strands of clay binding the straw together. But after I'd finished scratching in the base layers of texture, I got an idea. Enter the humble coffee grinder. I popped in a mix of wood shavings, toothpicks, and some rough twine, then blitzed it all together to get a dry, fluffy bundle of splinters. To make it adhere to the clay and tamp down on the dryness, I'll mix in some liquid clay, then messily slop the mixture onto my hay bale. It was a bit tough to work with, but honestly, after it's painted, this turned out to be a pretty darn good miniature hay texture. Now for the final piece, the barn floor. Then once we have our perfect disc, I'll mark in some plank lines one by one, before etching in some wood grain texture with a ball stylus. This will show up nicely with some paint washes later on. I'll also lift up a couple floorboards to add some variation in the texture and to show that this is some old wood flooring, warped and twisted by weather and age. And finally, that's our sculpture done, and we can start it on the painting. With everything primed white and ready to go, I'll start off by painting the body, mostly using my airbrush. This gets an even coat of paint, getting into all of the little textured bits that would be harder to reach with a brush without obscuring some of the texture. With the base colors finished, I'll add a darker wash to the straw legs and arms to sink into the recesses and add a nice shading. Then while that dries, I'll paint the cavernous pumpkin holes black, and line the raw pumpkin flesh edges in a pale orange. Then the pumpkin gets a very watery sepia wash to deepen some of the texture and add some age and dirty weathering. Then I can dry brush the straw to bring back some of the raised bits and lighten the edges, followed by some detail treatment on the bones to make them stand out. Then I'll dry brush the pumpkin to highlight the texture, and weather the bones to make them look a little bit less shiny and new. As the final touch, I'll paint the ropes brown, enhanced with some washes and gray dry brushing. I painted the other two pumpkins together, since that way I could avoid cleaning out the airbrush as much between coats. I decided to make each pumpkin a slightly different shade of orange so that the sculpture as a whole didn't look too monotone, although it's still predominantly orange, beige, and brown. The carved holes get painted black to imply the pumpkins are hollow and deep, and then I'll rim each carved edge in pale orange veggie flesh. Then I'll wash both pumpkins in some watery sepia wash, sinking into every crevice. Checking my reference, I noticed that the stem isn't actually brown, so I added some deep green dry brushing to each stem, and then topped the tips in a lighter tone. Finally, I'll dry brush both in a lighter orange to bring back all of that texture from the sculpting process. And we're on to the hay bale. This was pretty simple, following the same process as the arms and legs, but it was really nice to see the wood chips and clay become unified in color and actually start to look like straw. It's really fun doing little texture experiments like this, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out, especially after the dry brushing and coloring in the ropes. Then I can paint the wood a woody brown, and then deepen all of the wood grain texture with a black wash, followed by some simple dry brushing, and a black rim around the edges. But pumpkins can't carve other pumpkins without something to slice with. I cut out a little knife out of some balsa wood, sanding it smooth to give it a thin edge. Then I'll paint it brown and silver, and we're on to the last final touches. I made a wee mistake here by using a spray varnish on each of the pieces, and then touching them with my fingers. This caused some of the paint on the pumpkins to start to come off, but fortunately I was able to touch it up a little, and the streaking kinda just adds to the natural feel of the pumpkin patch. At least that's what I tell myself. Then I'll take some hot glue and stick each piece in place, and add a few autumn leaves, scattered by the breeze. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more autumn-themed sculptures before the season passes. And if you're watching this outside of fall, leave a comment anyways. It's always in season. Big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, supporting little creations like this and helping me bring these sculptures to YouTube. You're the best pumpkins in the patch. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe for more sculptures coming your way. I'll see you next time.